Before I say too much, I just want Helen, would you like to say a few words of introduction at the beginning before we start?
Yes, welcome to this last event of the summer term. We are planning another set of sessions in the autumn term and the spring term, so they've all been very enjoyable, and they are a very good way of engaging with different audiences. So I want to thank today's speaker and Andrew for organising it, and as Ola says, we're recording it and we'll be sharing a blog and the output in due course. But we've all enjoyed these CIMR debates in public policy, and I'm looking forward to this one. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Helen. Yes, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm excited by today's debate. I think it's going to be really interesting. So my name is Andrew Atter. I'm afraid I don't have my camera on. Something's jinxed my my camera because of I'm crossing platforms and so on. But anyway, if you bear with me, I'll just have voice on. I will be here. Yes, today's session should be a really good discussion. We have Charles Radclyffe, who's co-founder of Ethics Grade, and this is a relatively new company that's setting up an ESG investing and digital values index. So I think it's going to be really interesting, and AI is positioned in the context of that. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how Charles is disseminating information about what is good and what's quality in terms of ESG and AI investing. And then we have Riham Satti, who is a co-founder of an award-winning startup called Mavitae. And Riham is a former neuroscience researcher, and her team have developed an AI solution to removing tacit bias in recruitment. Obviously very timely and very important at this point in time. So Riham's research shows how bias can extend all the way through to job advertising and how CVs are written. And this is very much in the context of obviously broader concerns around social justice and inclusion. So it's great to have these different perspectives. Along with Charles and Riham, we have Joe Mangnani, who is an alumni, I think a recent alumni of Birkbeck. I think you've just recently finished your MSc with a distinction in business innovation and e-business. So congratulations, Joe. And also has a background, decades of experience in telecommunications, technology, and has worked in finance and fintech and manufacturing and logistics right across numerous industries. And has worked as a solutions architect, designing voice and data networks. So, and has worked very much on the client partner side. So, really good perspective. So, we'll go with Charles first, and then we'll have 15 minutes presentation, 5 minutes for clarification questions, and then Riham will repeat that pattern: 15 minutes presentation, 5 minutes to clarify any questions arising from the presentation. And then we'll have 15 minutes more general discussion, which Joe will facilitate at the end. So, so unless there's any questions, it's just we get right into it. It'll be a packed session. Really looking forward to it. So, Charles, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to everyone who's joined the session today. It's a real great delight to present to you all. I've got no slides. You'll be happy to hear. It's just me going to be talking. There's really kind of three things that I'd like to try and convey in the time that I've got. Firstly is starting to look at the techlash, why over the last 10 years we have collectively fallen out of love with technology. And I hope that will set the scene for my case, which is really why we need to think more in a much more maximalist view towards what ethics means. And I'll offer some thoughts in terms of how how ethics can be looked at, maybe in a slightly different way, but hopefully in a much more practical way in terms of operations relationship to ethics and tech. And then lastly, I'll just touch on what we're doing at Ethics Grade, because we're in a very strange cross section, I would say, of we're looking at the ethics of technology, but we're also using technology ourselves, and so therefore all of these issues are things which we have to live and breathe ourselves every day. So yeah, very much looking forward to your questions particularly. So hopefully I'll allow sufficient time, hopefully ample time for your questions. So start off with just a little bit background about me. I guess for me, this topic is so interesting and so important to me because my academic background was I studied law, and for a very short period of time I intended to go into legal practice, but the aspect of the law which was most interesting to me was actually jurisprudence and legal philosophy and legal history. So really the kind of origins of, have law and the impact of law on society and our relationships between each other. And I just found this a fascinating field of study. But the truth is there was very little career prospects for me if I was to pursue that line of thinking. I wasn't good enough to be an academic, for sure, and really that was the only career path open. And so I chose my second love, which was technology, and I spent my career in the tech industry. And for most of my career, I had looked back at my legal degree and my academic background as a bit of a distraction, a bit of a self-indulgence from what I would spend the rest of my career doing. And that was until about 10 years ago. I was running a data analytics company in London, focused mostly on financial clients in the capital markets. And in that role, we had a phenomenally talented team of engineers who were solving challenges for clients. And one of the things I noticed was that there was a big disconnect between the enthusiasm that our engineers had for the challenge in front of them, which they fell in love with in many cases. The challenge that a client was bringing to us, and for them it was about getting deep into that challenge and finding the technical breakthrough to solve the problem. And that was really where our engineers were focused. There's a big disconnect between that and where I was often finding myself, which was actually maybe there was some impacts that hadn't been considered from what we were doing, and maybe we were in times crossing a invisible, creepy line in terms of the technology we were developing. And this feeling grew over time, and I started to develop more and more public speaking and writing on this subject, and I started to talk about digital ethics, and I really started to make this case for, while we have lots of data scientists, we actually need more maybe data philosophers, people who are looking at the impact of technology on society. And this wasn't, me originating a field of interest. I'm one of a long tradition of people who've looked at the impact of technology on society. But most of those voices we've lost, in terms of we don't hear those voices anymore, and their work is sort of destined to the shelves of history. But I would encourage people on the call to look at writers such as Lewis Mumford, who was an American historian who wrote about the impact of technology on society. But he was writing about 100 years ago, and he was writing predominantly on the impact of industrialization on society. But what's really uncanny about reading his work, particularly Technics and Civilization, is how much of his concerns and his worries about the use of technology, its impacts, are so very, very true today. And hopefully we can talk about Lewis Mumford in the Q&A. So I found myself, really kind of going back to my roots, I would say, over the last 10 years. But 10 years ago, and just to give you some context here, in 2011, Mark Zuckerberg was the Time magazine Person of the Year. And so it was very difficult to really speak of Google or Facebook or any of the other big tech companies in a cautious tone. People, I'm sure, felt that I was somewhat unhinged, perhaps, in raising concerns about technology. Technology could do no wrong, and technology had really elevated from the kind of the geeky background that it had in the sort of 80s and 90s to this kind of very sort of clear masters of the universe type mindset, which it adopted at the early part of this century. And I suspect, and having worked in financial services, I guess this is biased my view, but I suspect it's the difference between the kind of the geeky, outcast view of technologists to today, where they're celebrated as heroes of industry. I think the difference really is the fact that since the year 2000, a lot of people have made a lot of money out of technology, and technology is seen as a very lucrative industry, and that's probably why we champion and celebrate technology entrepreneurs so greatly. But a lot has changed since 2011. And today, I think it's fair to say that there's a deep mistrust of technology, which is growing, unfortunately, greater every day and by every scandal that happens. And so for me, this was something which I've been thinking about deeply and concerned by. And through my work, I've realized this has become more and more core to what I need to think about. And so 3 years ago, I took up a role as head of AI at Fidelity, which is a large pensions and investments company. And this question of the techlash, this question of us falling out of love with technology, was really top of mind. The owner of the company, Abigail Johnson, she was is a very big advocate for technology and a very big supporter of us using things like blockchain or AI or other emerging technologies in improving Fidelity's operations. But she was also, or is also, somebody who is very, I would say, paranoid about the reputation of the organization, and particularly the reputation of her family, which is a family-owned organization. And so the command from the top was very much, you never ever damage the reputation, but do whatever you can within that constraint. And that's really the opposite of the kind of Mark Zuckerberg move fast and break things culture, which permeates Silicon Valley. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about not just how do we get the value from machine learning within Fidelity, but also how do we protect ourselves against the dark side. So in answering that, and it's very fortunate being in the investment industry, to get access to companies like Google or Microsoft or IBM, we just have to pick up the phone, because not only were we a big customer of theirs, but also we were a significant shareholder in each of those firms. And so, when you own 5% of Google, they did come in and answer your questions when you ask them, which is a very favorable position. So we did that. We asked the big tech companies, why they thought the techlash exists, and what they felt was important in terms of what we should do to mitigate it. And we were very deeply dissatisfied with the answers we had, fairly universally, because the answers we had were simply, here are the technical risks, here are the engineering problems that we see that we need to solve. This is the best practice. These are the processes that we need to follow. These are the standards we need to define. There was one set of answers, and the other set of answers was mostly focused around regulatory compliance. Here's where we see the intervention of regulators. Here's where we believe regulators should intervene. This is how you make sure you're compliant with GDPR or the CCPA or whatever other regulations that are proposed around different jurisdictions. And for us, that didn't really speak to why there is a techlash. And so the second exercise we did was we then went to speak to the big consulting firms, because if you go to talk to McKinsey or Bain or BCG or Accenture or PwC, you're dealing with some of the brightest minds who spend all of their days thinking about these problems as they relate to industry. And so we were hoping to find the answers there. But once again, the answers were quite dissatisfying and broke down into the same two categories. Some group of answers were about how do we say compliant, and the second group of answers were how do we technically manage the situation. And we didn't really feel that spoke to the issues at hand. So we did a sort of another piece of work to really understand why people have fallen out of love with technology. And the conclusion we reached, and this is a conclusion that I wrote up in a white paper called Ethical by Design about 2 years ago. The conclusion that we reached was that really the loss of trust in technology stems from the lack of stakeholder engagement and the feedback loop that's missing in terms of engaging with stakeholders. And what I mean by that is that technology is done to us in many regards. When Apple decides to remove the headphone socket from the latest iPhone, or when they decide to make headphones that are impossible to repair, we have no voice in that design process. We have no ability to raise those concerns in any meaningful way for Apple or Google or Microsoft or IBM or Huawei or any other technology company to listen to. So it's very much a computer, not just a computer says no culture where it's algorithmic decision making having an impact on us, but it's also the corporations themselves have designed themselves in such a way as to limit the amount of stakeholder feedback. I mean, sure, they do user testing and sure they do focus groups, but in terms of the scale that organizations have, actually organizations like Facebook actively discourage any user engagement on these issues. They simply say, well, we have 3 billion users, it's therefore impossible for us to do anything other than create noise. And we felt that that was a key differentiator, or key difference rather, between the technology industry as it is today and the technology as it was last century, and also other industries in the last century who had much smaller scale, but also potentially had a much better, much stronger stakeholder engagement. And if we thought about this question, we realized that actually there's a discipline in philosophy which looks at ethics as being a question of intersubjectivity being really the dialogue between each of us as individuals and the power structures across society. And analyzed in this way, it's quite attractive to see that really a company that's performing well on an ethical best practice is a company that engages well with stakeholders and takes that stakeholder feedback on board and incorporates that into its design and in its products and in its route to market. And so what we did in that white paper was really summarize 3 domains of activity which are important for responsibility. The first domain, which we heard from the tech companies and the consulting firms, was the technical aspects, the engineering controls, which are very important and also largely speak to the challenges of bias and discrimination that are obviously so relevant to data technologies. The second domain is that of public policy, so regulatory compliance being one aspect of that, but also lobbying and designing for a better civic relationship between a company and its use of technology and society. But then this third domain of ethics really being about engaging with stakeholders and incorporating that feedback into the design of our products and systems. So those are the 3 domains that we set out in our white paper. And in writing this white paper, we realized that actually there was a very strong parallel between what we were thinking about and the development of similar sorts of issues in other fields, and particularly climate change came to our mind as an issue which, as early as the 1960s, people were writing about. The Silent Spring is a seminal book in this.
Charles, yeah.
Thank you. So it's a seminal book in this idea of sustainability, but really was written off as a fringe idea until much more recently. And so what we basically articulated in our white paper was that Cambridge Analytica and the events of 2016 was really the hole in the ozone layer moments of this relationship between tech and ESG. And so my last point really in the time I've got left is just to say, recognizing that technology governance, digital responsibility is an ESG issue is an important aspect of our social impact that corporations have, then actually we can treat it in exactly the same way. And that's really what we do at Ethics Grade. We rate and evaluate companies in the same way that Moody's or S&P provide ratings of financial measures of companies. We do exactly the same thing in terms of the impact of their technology. And we look at the impact environmental grounds, on its relationship to social justice issues, and also with relation to corporate governance. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we've got plenty of time for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, I thought we just might want to pause and just see if there are questions, either from the audience or Joe, you may have a question that relates to what Charles has said so far.
I totally concur with his the cornerstones of his white paper, the public policy, lobbying, and lobbying for civic involvement. I have a question there that is, yes, I know that at the moment the EU is going through an AI Act, and there are some convergences of that with GDPR, but one question is, how do we maintain this human oversight with cybersecurity to prevent data sets that are being used within artificial intelligence from being poisoned or modified? That is my question. How do we ensure ongoing human oversight for this?
Yeah, great question. So just to put it into context, so we identified as 3 domains of governance that's important. So public policy being one, technical risks being a second, and then ethics being the third. And so this question of human oversight in the design process and how you ensure data poisoning and good data governance, I mean, this is really falls into that technical domain more than the other 2. The good news is the European Commission, as you mentioned, do have a proposal for AI regulations, which will hopefully get through Parliament in the next 18 months or so and become law. And that really puts a burden on organizations to report and disclose along 2 different lines. One line is around what the Commission refers to as risk management systems. So essentially an organization needs to, in relation to its AI systems, needs to think about how could it go wrong and then take appropriate risk management activities as a result of that. The good thing about risk management is it's a very mature discipline. It's used in many different sectors. Financial services, this is kind of second nature, but in many other industries as well, there's strong risk management disciplines already existing, so we can just apply them to the new domain. And the second thing that the Commission asked for is something called quality management systems. And those people in the more technical realm of machine learning would probably call this MLOps, which is really a way of looking at the life cycle of a model, life cycle of data, and ensuring that processes are appropriate and followed, etc. And so the Commission encourages that, and in fact it's mandated for certain use cases, but for everything else it's going to be encouraged. And I think this is really going to move the bar in terms of the quality. When I was at Fidelity, we were introducing MLOps from scratch. That didn't, we were already doing machine learning, and it's true of many organizations today who may be even quite mature with their use of machine learning. They don't have appropriate risk management or quality management systems in place. So I think regulation is certainly going to help.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Joe. Any other questions, Joe, or is there anything coming up from the audience?
I think I'll save my other questions for later.
Yeah. Just a quick question from me, Charles. Just what's the reaction so far from investors in terms of embracing the index? Are they finding it useful? How are you yourself, getting feedback on the product you launched?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, we built Ethics Grade because of the gap I saw at Fidelity. Having lived in the role and being continuously asked by people on the investment management team what my team's view was on the governance of some of the companies that we were investing in. And I realized that we needed to be much more consistent about that. And in realizing, I realized that actually the best way to do that is set up a research business to look at that question specifically. So I guess we built Ethics Grade on the basis of one data point, one potential client, but with a very strong gut that this was something which is going to be relevant to more people. I think what's been a big surprise to us is that there's more than just investors who care about this. What we've had is a lot of interest from academics who want to do research on the data, and also journalists who love this stuff. I mean, journalists, when they write about sadly things going wrong, like a Tesla crashing, what they want is not just the anecdotal stuff. They want to know specifically, is Tesla weak on certain things and other car companies strong? Why is it that these things happen? And of course, we've got the data to provide that. So that's been a great learning. But in terms of investors, what we're finding is that it's the more sustainability focused investors who actually care the most about this. Not just because they're concerned about the environmental impact of tech, but obviously that is a very key ingredient, but also they've realized that social justice issues have really risen up their agenda over the last few years. They realized that technology can play a significant part in that. And also I think on economic grounds, COVID has really accelerated things because people recognize that the pandemic economic recovery is going to really hinge on how well people digitalize, and also how good they are at the tech of digitalization, but also how responsible they are around the digitalization. And so, if they're investing in airlines, for example, it's not just which airline is likely to, get its operations back off the ground, literally and metaphorically, but also, which is less likely to suffer a data breach or some sort of other disaster, which we've seen in the past. So yeah, so it's sustainability focused investors that we're getting the most demand from. But I'm speaking this afternoon with a major Scottish firm, and tomorrow with Fidelity, my former employer. So we're getting a lot of interest, which is fantastic.
Great, thanks, Charles. Thanks very much. Well, we'll certainly loop you back in and to the general discussion. So let's move on to Riham. Riham, and very interested to hear your talk. So are you ready to hand over?
Yep, no, absolutely. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Riham.
And thanks so much for the talk, Charles, as well. It was really informative. And thanks for all the attendees as well. I've got some slides, so I'm just going to share them right now, and hopefully everyone can see. Can everyone see my slides? Just be good to get some confirmation on that.
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant, fantastic. Well, hello everyone. My name is Riham Satti. I'm one of the co-founders of a technology company called Vitae. We've been around since 2014, and our aim really at Vitae is how do you mitigate biases, and I'm using the umbrella term here. And as Andrew has hinted before, kind of my background is in neuroscience, in fact, and before that engineering. So really enjoyed kind of being in the cusp of trying to solve real world problems and using technology to do that. And so the aim of what I'm going to talk about today is a bit about these biases that I'm referring to and how it impacts the space that we're in, which is the recruiting world. Really, how does it impact the hiring world, and how current methods and technologies are being used to try and mitigate and counteract it as much as possible. But I always like to start my slides with a kind of an interesting illustration, which is neurons, really. And as you may know, that our brain consists of neurons, billions of neurons, and they all communicate, and we all have trillions of connections between them. And our brain is kind of what I like to call it suboptimal, really. It's great at doing some things and not so great at doing others. So for example, speed accuracy trade-off, right? If you do something very, very quickly, you're more error prone. If you do something slowly, you're less error prone. Another thing might be knowledge base. We don't have infinite memory capacity. And so that could be another kind of suboptimal behavior that our brains have. We can't predict the future. But another one is kind of the term kind of cognitive emotional interactions or biases. And when I refer to biases in this case here, I'm talking about cognitive biases. And it's just the way that our brain kind of processes information, really. There's so much stimuli from the world that our brain has to absorb, auditory, olfactory, and all of this information, our brain has to process it really quickly and put it into kind of buckets or categories, really. And that's kind of how you end up with kind of stereotypes. But there's a lot of research that is kind of being conducted in this space. And one thing that we kind of discovered along the way is that there are different types of biases that exist in the human brain. And there's kind of research out there. There's about 140 types of cognitive biases out there. And they all impact different stages of what we call the hiring process. Everything from the moment we're considering hiring a candidate all the way up to actually being hired, and sometimes even beyond that. But about 60% of these types of biases take place during what we call the selection process or screening process. So the first time we see a CV, a cover letter, an application form, so most of these creep up. And you've got things like, stereotype biases, confirmation biases, which is if you've hired someone in the past that's come from a certain university or certain organizations, and you've had a positive experience, then you might hire them, hire another applicant with the same background, for example. So you're confirming biases. You've got the Google effect, for example, which is, if you can easily Google something, you're more likely to forget it. So all of these kind of types of biases impact every decision making that we have in life, but also in the world that we're in, which is HR as well. And I want to just show you kind of quickly an example of that in the hiring world. So in the hiring world, we've got kind of the classic job descriptions that get posted out. So kind of the terminology that we use in these job descriptions impacts what kind of candidates are attracted to a role. When you start going through screening process, when recruiters, hiring managers, or even just employers in general look at these CVs and cover letters, what kind of words and catches their attention when screening them and putting them through to the next stage of the hiring process. Same thing when we're interviewing candidates. There was some research that was conducted that says within 300 milliseconds of seeing a candidate, you've kind of made a decision. And so it impacts every choice that we make. And we can never physically remove biases from the human brain, but what we try and do is try and mitigate it. And we conducted a study here in the UK with a university where we asked employers or recruiters, in other words, participants, to look at CVs. And we gave them 10 seconds to review different CVs. And what I'm going to show you now is kind of a heat map of that. So in 10 seconds, where do their eyes look? Where do their eyes gravitate towards? And what we discovered is red means employers, participants look at these areas more. Blue means least amount of time. So we identified that, generally speaking, employers may look at someone's name, which we know is not an indicator of talent, university name, company name, and if someone's got a confirmation bias, for example, might impact decision making, location, job title, which varies from organization to organization, and also hobbies and interests, right? And so, but that also doesn't necessarily mean talent, right? It can be just an interesting piece of information. Sometimes it is related to the role. And so what we want to try and do is recalibrate our eyes to try and focus on things that are important in the hiring world. And currently a lot of organizations, and I'm talking corporate, startups, scale-ups, focus a lot on certain strategies to try and mitigate these cognitive and unconscious biases in the hiring process. The most classic one that is referred to quite a bit is bias training or unconscious bias training, which is based on the implicit association test that was kind of built out in the 1990s. And here is kind of an illustration of that. What the IET test is about is it asks participants to categorize and put people into different boxes and using the characters E and I on the keyboard to categorize them. And what it does is it tries to measure your reaction time of how fast you are or how slow you are in putting people into certain categories. And that difference, that I there, will tell you how biased someone can potentially be. But you can also automatically see the potential flaws of that because it's measuring your reaction time. And this kind of triggered off one of the kind of key areas of kind of bias training. And it's like I said, it's really important to note that you can never physically remove biases from the human brain, but bias training is a good way to bring awareness. It's a good way to open up the conversation and get everyone engaged in an organization. And so also bias training doesn't necessarily involve kind of using the different levels of technology. And I've got this kind of really interesting slide that I discovered a few years back, in fact, which is by Tata Consultancy Services, which kind of maps out the blue areas, the science and technology foundations. We've got the classic internet, mobile, cloud, and then you've got these kind of intersections of blue and green, which is kind of innovation and upcoming technology, blockchain, 3D printing, drones, etc. And what you see in the yellow is kind of future technologies, right? Human machine convergence, for example, or smart cities. But what it's really kind of interests me is this kind of area in the middle, which is areas that are kind of growing and scaling, right? And looking into the changing notion of work, for example. And of course, this has definitely changed and it's been accelerated by COVID, right? Everyone's way of working has changed and adapted. The rise of independent workers, 5th-generation workers, technological unemployment, all of these areas are kind of growing in sector, and technology is alongside both of those. But in the world of kind of diversity and inclusion, that's not often, these use of these technologies are kind of far and in between. And so our stance at MiVita is, how do we use different forms of technology to try and mitigate these biases? And we've kind of the term we usually use in MiVitai is augmented intelligence. And this is purely because there's a lot of debate, and I think the media plays a big role in this, of man versus machine, right? AI is going to replace people, it's going to take over jobs, but at the same time it does create jobs. And so the stance of augmented intelligence, or IA, is that together machines plus humans or people is much more of an optimal integrated intelligence. And so we're using technology to enhance people and make them better. But of course, we have to be aware that, of course, there is algorithmic biases as well. And there are different types of forms of algorithmic biases, but most of them, could arise from the data that's being used. And a classic example of that that is used time and time again in the hiring world is the Amazon case that kind of kick-started in 2015, where Amazon kind of built an algorithm that would use its past hiring data, about 10 years worth of its hiring data, to try and shortlist or rank future applicants that applied to roles. And eventually it started picking, it had a gender bias. More and more men were getting through to next stages of the hiring process. Eventually, Amazon's kind of scrapped this, but it was kind of one of the first examples of algorithmic biases in the hiring world. And since then, a lot of development, a lot of organizations have started investing a lot of money into it. And within MiVitai, for us personally, we've spent 4 or 5 years building a lot of our technology from the ground up, as well as the whole aim trying to mitigate some of these biases that I'm referring to. But I want to kind of touch on some of these kind of options that a lot of organizations can start looking into that will help them with trying to mitigate these biases that I'm referring to. And some of these are the classic, job descriptions. There is like a free tool out there that's called Gender Decoder, which you can put in your job description and it will tell you whether it's more masculine or feminine. And as an experiment, I instead of putting in the job description, I put in my CV just to see. So it's a good experiment to try it out. And there's that's kind of really helps with the very earliest stages of the hiring process. Something that we offer here at MiVitai is kind of the blind recruiting. How do you redact personal identifiable information directly from resumes? The next thing could be, how do you screen and shortlist top talent, right? How do you go from hundreds of CVs to the top 10 or the top 5? But again, a lot of the technology that we use today that is out there uses kind of keyword matching, but I'll elaborate on that in a minute. But also the kind of last thing is kind of measuring metrics throughout, right? Data can be very, very powerful if used right. There is a lot of noise in data, of course, but if we can harness it and make use of it, then it has a lot of potential. And touching on these kind of different areas of technology, an area is linguistics, and that's an area that we're really passionate about at MiVitai. And I touched upon kind of keyword matching as being a way that a lot of technology is being used that allows candidates to be able to, organizations to be able to shortlist candidates. But there's a few issues with keyword matching, right? If you have a candidate that writes Python 1,000 times when the job description says it once, you can always easily bypass that. If someone writes down that are related to Python, even though you're looking for that, keyword matching will fail. And so this is where you start jumping into the world of kind of semantics, understanding the correlation between skills and competencies. And something that we've invested a lot of our time here at MiVitai of trying to understand the ontology of how things work, not on just the first layer, but second and third. And that allows us to be able to understand correlations and understand kind of fit to as much as possible. But it's really important, and it's important to note that we can't really standardize talent. Talent comes in different shapes and sizes. But an example of it being applied to this linguistics is kind of what I touched upon on LinkedIn, on blind recruiting. So how do you use blind recruiting to try and mitigate biases? And I showed that kind of eye tracking piece earlier. And so if we redacted someone's name, for example, it looks like a bit like a CIA or an FBI document, but it just kind of just shows an illustration. If we redact someone's name, for example, then they're spending most of their time looking at other areas like the skills, the competencies. If you redact university, then if someone has a confirmation bias, for example, that will help mitigate that. And so there's different areas and ways that we can use technology to try and mitigate these biases. And talking about kind of these biases, another area, and this was we were interviewed by the Centre of Data Ethics and Innovation here at the UK, where they interviewed a few companies around recommendations. Yep, last slide anyway. So around how do you also mitigate algorithmic biases, and some of the recommendations is making sure that not using technology for the sake of using it. So, making sure there's a good fit and it solves a problem. The data being used is cleansed and it's not noisy, but also represents what it should be and not what it is at the moment. Being transparent, and that's something that we're trying to do here at MiVita, is making sure that how did the machine come up with a decision, and being transparent about it, and also being accountable, right? How do you kind of build technology, all these buzzwords, ML, AI, etc. How do you remain accountable to actually building these and making sure that they impact, are doing the right thing when making hiring decisions? And a lot of the cases, the decision lies with the organization, because machines and AI and machine learning and all of these techniques are meant to be enhancing as opposed to replacing. But this is just a quick whistle-stop tour, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions on the back of that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Riham. That's bang on time. Thank you. Joe, any questions? Any questions from the audience? Anything stirred up out there? Specific, and just for the next 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes or so, just specifically on Riham's presentation, and then we'll open it up for more general debate.
I've got a number of questions. It's just a question of which one I put in first.
That sounds ominous, Riham.
Take your pick.
You're all day, I think.
I mean, how can we ensure that this actually gets generalized commitment from the business at large? That's my only concern. This is absolutely admirable, and this is a great place to start. But how do we make companies obliged to be transparent, and how do we get them to basically work on, address all of these concerns, which are basically at the moment seem to be, with AI, breaching fundamental rights?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think my answer comes down to kind of policy and regulation, is the honest answer. When, for example, when we had GDPR right beforehand, we were kind of in a similar situation. When kind of GDPR kicked in, organizations had to kind of pick up their game, start to consider what they're going to do with their data. And we've still got a long way to go. We're nowhere near scratch the surface. But there needs to be some sort of regulation, but also potentially some auditing needs to happen. And that's also one of the recommendations that the CDEI had around kind of auditing technology. None of that is being there's only a rare few companies that are looking into that at the moment. But that could be a potential other way, right, to be able to try and make sure that organizations are accountable. But the only kind of hesitation is that it shouldn't be just a tick box exercise. There needs to be some sort of kind of process and output at the back of that, and actions for organizations to take on board. But I think, it comes down to kind of policies and having that some sort of regulation around that.
Can I ask another question?
Absolutely.
So another question for me is that I understand that from the initiatives from Horizon Europe and the European AI Act, at the moment they are mindful that a lot of these governance proposals can basically inundate companies, and they are looking at a self-assessment technique and on which they can then regulate. Do you think that's sufficient as a starting point or not?
Anything's a good starting point if we just start. Is the short answer. The only question or comment I would say is, with a lot of kind of assessments, how do you define fairness, right? How do you even standardize that? All right. How do you compare and level or benchmark when a lot of these kind of organizations that use AI and machine learning, a lot of it is a black box situation. and they'll spend years building all forms of technology with the aim of forming some sort of output. But eventually, when you're using things like machine learning, it's very hard to kind of, when it's a machine that's learning, how do you even know what is happening in the background? Or it can sometimes be very, very tricky. So it's a matter of what is being assessed whilst building these kind of types of strategies and tools, and making sure that we have a way that does kind of represent what we think it should be representing, and making sure that there is some sort of fairness alongside it, because it will vary from sector to sector or industry to industry, from organisation to organisation. So there needs to be some sort of kind of leeway around how we measure that, really. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Charles, especially with your work at ethics grade.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, firstly, it's great what you guys are doing. And secondly, just to add to your answer, in terms of, regulation can certainly help. I think if tools like this are encouraged or even mandated in certain industries, or maybe more broadly, I think that's a very positive step. But I think that's also the role that organizations like mine play, in terms of, a rating agency is essentially looking for evidence of governance. And there's two aspects, I think, which are relevant here. What I focus my talk is about how you make sure that the technology you use is well designed and you're using it responsibly. But there's also a second factor, which is ensuring that certain things which, technology, the use of technology is actually best practice. And I think this is a great example where, now we have the abilities to process language and to be able to, provide essentially, blind candidate screening so that biases can be removed from the selection process. Then actually that is, why wouldn't you do that if you're an organization? And so that's certainly something you can benchmark. If you look at, airlines or food and drink, which of them use this technology and which of them don't. And that's exactly the sort of research and data that we offer. The problem with the specific question that Joe asked about in terms of the European Commission's assessment list for trustworthy AI, or ALTI, is the tool is kind of useful in terms of it steps through. I mean, it is a self-service tool. I think that's one point, is it means you don't actually need a consultant or anyone from the outside to help you answer the questions. It kind of guides you through it. So it's good on that front. But the problem is what you're left with is a kind of assessment of, how well do you do against the European Commission's anxieties from a kind of scale of 0 to 5. I think there's 7 different dimensions that the tool spits out. So if you score a 1 and a 2 for all of the questions, but maybe 5 for one of them, well, what does that mean? Like, is that good for a company like yours, a company in your industry? And that's really where I think a peer comparison is so useful. So that's really where, people find our data so valuable, because they're getting not just, British Airways is is an X or a Y or a Z grade, and this is their score, but you're also getting where do they sit compared to other organizations. And I think it's fair to say that an airline isn't a technology company. So an airline, you wouldn't necessarily expect that all aspects of technology governance would be very strong. But if you're Facebook, you really should expect it to be very strong. And so I think that's really one of the big weaknesses with the European Commission's ALTI tool. So I concur with Riham, a good start, but there's a lot more that you can do beyond that.
Helen's got a question.
Yeah, it's on this comparisons issue. I'm not sure that I followed all the argument, but when they're setting up these AI tools for recruitment, are they benchmarked against humans doing it? Would you have a pool, say we get 150 people wanting to apply for an entrepreneurship lectureship post? If we did it by hand and then we put the AI tool on it, how would it differ, and what would we be looking for?
So that is one way to do a comparison, but that doesn't necessarily probably the most optimal way, because the person who's doing those assessments may be biased themselves. And so that's assuming that the employer or the recruiter who's made that shortlist is correct and right on their shortlist. And so another kind of approach is, yes, you can compare, but you need to look at not just what's out on the kind of the CVs that's out there to shortlist talent, right? And so another approach would be, looking at taking a CV, taking the job description, breaking it up into as many components as possible, using as much, sterilizing clean data as much as possible, to look at other areas in their CV that, let's say they studied computer science at Oxford. What kind of things do they study at Oxford? What kind of modules? How does that correlate to the job description? And running a comparison between that, and then seeing, actually, is that similar to the person who's made the shortlist, right? So that could be another approach to do it. But it makes the assumption that the person who made that shortlist is correct. Does that make sense, Helen?
Yes, it's just that when we appoint and you get 150 applications and then you have to go through the shortlisting process, yes, I suppose it is rather arbitrary. We do have a set of criteria in our mind, but we could be missing things as you're suggesting. It is very, very complicated. So thank you for explaining it.
No worries. It is, yeah. It gets very complicated and very messy very quickly. And I guess that's why technology has its benefits there.
Okay.
I just wanted to generalize that question and say, given that we know that racism, misogyny, and other evils are embedded in society, and we've had recent experiences of that, obviously, over the weekend, what standards are we setting for AI? And who decides on what those standards are? So, for example, are we looking, if we were talking about, let's take GPT-3, for example, voice AI, right? Are we looking for perfection on that? So it must be cleansed of racism, misogyny, and other forms of bias and irrational things introduced by coders? Or are we willing to accept a certain tolerance on that, which obviously it's very discomforting to even think about that, but to a certain level that we might say, well, that's still better than humans making those decisions. It's really a question for both of you, I think. How do we approach that standard setting, and who sets the standard?
Do you want to go ahead, Charles, and I can answer after?
Yeah, well, I think again, I'll cut to my definition of ethics. I don't think there is a standard. In fact, I think the standard is actually a dangerous trap to fall into. So it's one of the principal concerns I have with the ESG industry more generally, and that's, there's a bunch of people, former colleagues of mine, and their friends and colleagues, who sit in places like Bishopsgate or Wall Street, and who decide how to make essentially value judgments between different issues. And so, what I'm talking about there is, you're trading off social justice against climate. You're trading off pollution against climate. Even something like social justice, if we all agree that equality is important and the most important thing that we should focus on, then are we talking about all aspects of equality? Are we talking about age, race, gender, etc.? And you can very quickly see that you're going to get into an intractable position where you're very unlikely to find consensus, because everyone comes with their own perspective and their own point of view and their own prejudice and their own life experience. And so actually, values and ethics are a very personal thing. And this is really where I come back to this idea of intersubjectivity, to really understand, to really understand the impact of something. You really need to understand the impact on the individuals within your stakeholder group. And so I think there are things where we should standardize. And I think that's really around comparing apples with apples. When we're talking about CO2 emissions or carbon neutral, we need to kind of reach common agreement in terms of what is the definition of terms like that. And when we're talking about, gender equality, for example, in a social justice context, we need to be very precise about what does that term mean, because otherwise it's very hard, impossible in fact, to compare two organizations that say they have, they're delivered on those promises. But in terms of being able to compare organizations to each other, I think that's a much more personalized thing. And so our view on that is that actually the profile that we need to build is a two-sided profile. Not just should we be profiling organizations and saying this is our view of the world, like every other ESG company does, but also we should be understanding the profiles of our users, so that if you say to me that the most important thing is eliminating bias in the recruitment process, then you can dial those things up and then see ethics grade scores, for example, with that as the most important consideration. But if you're somebody else with a different background, you may have the view that it's not that issue that's the most important, it's something else that's most important, and therefore you can cut the data according to that way. So I would, in summary, I'd be very careful with standardization as the solution. It's deceptively attractive, but I think it can get us into all sorts of trouble.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Yeah, Riham?
I was going to add to that as well. I completely agree with what Charles is saying, but not to be pessimistic at all, but the only way to remove any form of bias in any algorithm, in any AI, is to not have people, right? That's the short answer, right? Because as long as there's people, there's always going to be biases, and there's always going to be decisions that are made that have some sort of subjective behavior to it. And so that's something we should all be aware of when thinking about this, right? The aim is not to kind of we're going to try and remove and everything out there, because it's physically not possible, because there's still people making decisions. But I agree that the creating a standard is going to be very, very tricky when you'll compare every organization, every entity has their own USP or their own competitive advantage, their own angle on something. So it's going to be very tricky because there's always going to be a differentiation one way or another, maybe in size, maybe in industry, maybe in the technology. So to be able to measure that and compare it will be very, very tricky. But it needs to be some sort of, essentially maybe starting off with mapping where we are, just as a starting point to understand what organizations are currently doing in this space, as just kind of an exploratory discussion, to actually, before even trying to build some sort of like framework around this, because I'd be interested to know people in the HR world, what they're involved in, what their kind of agendas and processes are going to be around in this topic, and being able to see, can we kind of provide some sort of kind of guidance or general kind of consensus that will try and that everyone can somehow kind of adhere to. What that is, I'm not necessarily sure, and that's probably something that I'm going to have to think about very closely. But I'm kind of hopeful that we've kind of, this discussion has started now rather than later on, and that it's going to be something that's going to be more and more prominent over the next years or decades, to be honest.
Yeah, thanks, Riham. Thanks, Charles. So we're approaching the end of the session. Joe, I just wondered if you've got any final thoughts or comments on what you've heard over the past hour.
So this has been a fantastic session. I really appreciated both speakers and their presentations. I just want to add one final point. I've been studying the AI Act. I've been looking at the so-called traffic light system that the EU has put in place. The question that I'm raising is, to what extent will the UK, now that Brexit has happened, will comply with that or work with that? But again, looking at Riham's presentation on employment, that falls into the amber zone, which is defined, according to them, high risk because of its intended purpose, and therefore needs more clarity. So the question is really, to what extent can we mobilize civic involvement in this so that we combine what Charles has talked about, where we have a combination of social philosophers as well as scientists to work alongside the policymakers, because I don't feel that the policymakers at the moment are equipped with all of the information they have to pass legislation. And And basically, I say that because of something that's going on at the moment, which is a debate, heated debate between MEPs and the EU on facial recognition systems, where again the MEPs are fighting for a right for democracy here and a ban on or a controlled use of facial recognition. That's just as an example. So basically, my question is, what can we do at this stage to adapt the EU's traffic light system, use what you suggested, Riham, as mapping with industries and also ensuring involvement from the scientific, the social philosopher community to actually underpin and represent civic duties or civic rights?
Thanks, thanks, Joe. That's a great question. I know I'm conscious that we've now come up against the end of the time. Perhaps we just, I don't know whether we've got time or not, but it doesn't sound like that's a short answer.
No.
So I think we may just want to leave that hanging and let it whet everybody's appetite for perhaps further work and then perhaps another session on this at some point when these things become clearer and we see what happens with the EU regulation and others. So I just want to draw it to a close and just to say, let's, thank you for both speakers for doing great work and bringing and sharing that work. It sounds very important, and to sort of shedding some light on this black box that's kind of beginning to govern so much of our lives. So Helen, just back to you. Any final comments? And thank you very much for joining us in this webinar.
Yes, well, thank you. It was amazingly interesting. I really enjoyed it. So thank you, Andrew, for great sharing. Thank you, Rhiannon and Charles, and Joe, for your really insightful and challenging questions. I thought it was a great session, and I shall encourage everybody to listen to it and read the blog. So it was fantastic. So really enjoyed it. So thank you very much, and thank you all for putting it all together and making sure that we were all in the right place at the right time. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Charles.
you.
Thanks, Rhiannon.
Bye.
I think that's everyone left. Yes. Okay. Thanks a lot, Helen. Talk to you soon. Yeah. Cheers.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It was terrific. So thank you.
Yeah. There's quite a lot in there. Yeah. All the best.
Yeah.
Talk to you soon.
Really good. Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for involving me, Helen.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks. That's great.
Well done,
Great
Joe.
talk.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Ola.